HOA Karen kidnapped a Marine's dog. He got knocked out before cops arrived. The gavel of the HOA board slammed down like a judge sentencing me to death, and Karen smiled like she'd already won. "Your dog is officially seized, Mr. Reyes," she said, holding my golden retriever's leash like a trophy. "House rules." I lunged forward, and the next thing I remember was the parking lot concrete slamming into the side of my skull. Sirens. Blue and red lights spinning across my vision. Someone was screaming my name. Someone else was laughing. That laugh belonged to Karen. Even as I bled on the asphalt, she stood over me, arms crossed, smug and untouchable. "My name is Daniel Reyes, 34, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I never thought a neighborhood board would be the fight of my life. I bought my house in Meadow Creek Estates 8 months earlier, a quiet cul-de-sac with good schools and, I thought, good people. My dog, Biscuit, was a service animal, trained to interrupt my nightmares before they became something worse." Karen Whitfield ran the HOA board like a personal kingdom, and everyone in the neighborhood tiptoed around her like she carried a badge. I didn't know yet that she'd been waiting for someone like me, someone with a different kind of dog, a different kind of face. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after I moved in, a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. "Unapproved landscaping," it read, though my lawn looked identical to every other lawn on the street. I laughed it off. Just paperwork, I thought. Just some overzealous volunteer with a clipboard and too much time. I had no idea that clipboard belonged to a woman who'd already destroyed 2 families before me and gotten away clean. Karen's official title was HOA president, but her real title, whispered behind closed doors, was the Queen of Meadow Creek. She'd banned a family's wheelchair ramp for aesthetic violations. She'd fined a widow for wind chimes. Nobody fought back. Until me. I fought back because I'd survived worse than a woman with a laminated rulebook and a superiority complex. My neighbor Chelsea, a nurse who worked night shifts, warned me my first week. "Don't cross her. She keeps files on people." "Files?" I asked. Chelsea just nodded, glancing over her shoulder like Karen might materialize from the hedges. I should have listened. Instead, I mowed my lawn on a Tuesday instead of the approved Wednesday, and the war began. A fine arrived in my mailbox. $50. Absurd, but I paid it, wanting peace more than principle. 2 weeks later, another fine. Then another. My mailbox filled with violations for things that didn't exist. My trash cans weren't visible a full 6 minutes past the rule. My blinds were the wrong shade of white. I started photographing everything, my lawn, my cans, my blinds, dating each picture, building a folder I didn't yet know I'd need. Chelsea saw the folder growing on my kitchen table. "Smart," she said. "She's done this before. Nobody ever had proof." I asked her what happened to the others. She looked away. They moved. Couldn't afford the fines. Couldn't afford the lawyers. That night I sat with Biscuit's head on my lap and made a decision. I would not be the third family that ran. I didn't know Karen had already noticed my folder, my camera, my quiet defiance, and she doesn't forget people who don't bow. The first real declaration of war came disguised as a friendly knock on my door on a Sunday morning. Karen stood there in pearls and a cardigan, holding a folder thicker than mine. "We need to discuss your dog," she said. "Biscuit's registered as a service animal," I told her, showing the paperwork I always kept ready. She barely glanced at it. "Golden retrievers aren't listed under our approved service breed policy." "That's not how the ADA works," I said, my voice calm even as my pulse climbed. Karen smiled the smile of someone who'd rewritten reality so many times she believed her own lies. "It's how my HOA works." She left a fine on my counter before I could stop her, $300 for an unauthorized animal on premises. I called the HOA's management company. They apologized, said Karen sometimes overstepped, but did nothing to reverse the fine. That night, someone left a note on Biscuit's doghouse: "Dogs like that don't belong here." No signature. I knew exactly whose handwriting it was. I started recording every interaction after that. Every knock, every letter, every fine went into a growing case file on my laptop. I didn't tell Karen I was documenting everything. I let her believe I was just another neighbor she could steamroll. Chelsea started helping quietly, texting me photos of Karen's own violations, the ones she conveniently never fined herself for. Karen's fence was 2 feet over the height limit. Her shed had no permit. Her own dog wasn't leashed half the time. She thinks the rules are a leash for everyone else, Chelsea said, and a costume she gets to take off. I began attending every HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back, taking notes, watching how she operated. She ran meetings like a courtroom where she was judge, jury, and the only witness allowed to speak. Residents who challenged her got clerical delays on their requests for months. Compliant residents got smiles and quick approvals. I raised my hand once to ask about the service animal policy. She cut me off before I finished my sentence. "We'll circle back," she said, the phrase everyone in the room recognized as a death sentence for any complaint. After the meeting, an older resident named Mr. Okafor pulled me aside. "You're the veteran with the dog. Watch your back." He told me Karen had a cousin on the county zoning board. That's how she always seemed one step ahead. That single piece of information changed everything. This wasn't just a bully with a clipboard, it was a network. I realized fighting Karen with common sense wouldn't work. I needed something she couldn't spin, delay, or bury: hard, undeniable evidence. That night I set up a small camera on my porch, angled toward the street and my own front lawn. I told myself it was for security. Really, it was for war. 2 days later, the camera caught something I never expected: Karen letting herself onto my property while I was at work. She was in my backyard, holding a tape measure to my fence, muttering into her phone about code enforcement leverage. I watched the footage that night, hands shaking, torn between rage and something close to relief. Finally, proof. But I also felt a chill. If she was willing to trespass for a fence, what would she do for a dog she wanted gone? I didn't know it yet, but Karen had already started a private folder of her own, titled simply Reyes, Removal Plan. The next morning, I found Biscuit's leash cut clean through, lying in 2 pieces by the fence. My hands trembled holding that severed leash, the frayed nylon edges telling a story no accident could explain. I checked my porch camera immediately. The footage from that section had been mysteriously deleted, someone knew exactly where to look. Chelsea came over within minutes, examining the cut. "That's not wear and tear, Daniel. That's a blade." I filed a police report, though the officer's shrug told me how seriously a leash incident would be taken. Karen, of course, had an alibi ready before I'd even mentioned her name. I was at a board luncheon all afternoon. Convenient, I thought, that she offered an alibi to a crime nobody had accused her of yet. The HOA newsletter that week featured a glowing article about community safety, written, unsurprisingly, by Karen herself. Buried in paragraph 4 was a new, temporary policy: all pets must be leashed and kept indoors during community events. A community event, it turned out, was scheduled for that very Saturday, a mandatory HOA lawn inspection. I felt the trap closing before it even sprang, like watching dominoes lined up and knowing which way they'd fall. Saturday came and Karen arrived with 2 board members and a clipboard, randomly selecting my house first. Biscuit, despite my careful compliance, was technically outdoors for the 4 seconds it took him to relieve himself in my own yard. Karen's smile was radiant as she wrote the violation. "Third offense, Mr. Reyes. Per our bylaws, the animal must be surrendered for evaluation." Evaluation was a word designed to sound clinical while meaning something much colder: confiscation. I refused. Karen threatened to call animal control, citing aggressive owner behavior that existed only in her narration. That's when I made the mistake that nearly cost me everything. I raised my voice, stepped toward her, defending my dog. Karen's board members flinched back theatrically, as if I'd swung a fist instead of simply raised my tone. By Monday, a formal complaint had been filed against me for threatening HOA personnel, with 2 board members as witnesses. I realized then how carefully she'd built her trap: provoke, document, punish, repeat, until I looked like the villain. Chelsea sat with me that night, going through my footage frame by frame. We need more than anger. We need patterns. We started cross-referencing every fine Karen had issued over 3 years, comparing them against actual bylaw text. What we found stopped my breath: dozens of fines issued for rules that didn't exist in any approved document. Karen had been quietly rewriting bylaws in her own handwritten, supplemental guidelines, never approved by a resident vote. Homeowners had paid over $40,000 combined in fines based on rules she'd invented herself. This wasn't just a bully anymore. This was fraud, dressed up in cardigans and community spirit. I brought this to a lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Anand who specialized in HOA disputes. Priya's eyebrows rose reading my folder. This is the most documented case of HOA overreach I've seen in a decade. She warned me, though, Karen had powerful friends, including that cousin on the zoning board Mr. Okafor mentioned earlier. If we go public too soon, Priya said, she'll bury the evidence before it ever reaches a judge. We needed a plan that moved in silence, gathering ammunition while Karen believed she was still winning. I started attending every board meeting with a hidden recorder, capturing her admitting things she'd never put in writing. One night, drunk on her own power, she bragged to a board member about handling the veteran situation permanently. My blood ran cold hearing those words on playback. This wasn't about a leash anymore. This was personal and dangerous. Chelsea discovered something else: Karen's late husband had left the HOA reserve fund in worse shape than anyone knew. Fines weren't just about control. They were funding a shortfall Karen desperately needed to hide before an audit. Every violation was quietly padding a fund she'd have to answer for if the county ever came asking. Suddenly her obsession with fining me, specifically, made a colder kind of sense. I was the resident who kept records. If I went down loudly enough, publicly enough, it would scare off anyone else thinking of questioning the books. I was never just a nuisance to Karen. I was a threat to a secret she'd buried for years. And she was about to make her boldest, most reckless move yet to bury that secret even deeper. On a Thursday afternoon, I came home from a doctor's appointment to find my driveway gate wide open. Biscuit was gone. No note, no bark, no sign of struggle, just an empty yard and a silence that screamed. I called Chelsea, my voice cracking in a way it hadn't since my last deployment. Someone took my dog. We checked my camera. This time it hadn't been deleted, it had captured everything, clear as daylight. Karen, in her own car, in her own driveway clothes, leading Biscuit by a spare leash into her garage. My mind went blank with a fury I hadn't felt since combat. I drove to her house before I could think twice. Her garage door was still half open when I arrived and I could hear Biscuit barking, frantic, from inside. Karen stepped out, arms crossed, that same infuriating calm on her face. He was a stray, Mr. Reyes. I was being neighborly. He has a collar. He has a chip. He has a leash you cut yourself, I said, stepping forward. Something in her eyes flickered, not guilt, but calculation, like she was already writing the story she'd tell police. I reached for Biscuit's leash and that's when her home security guard, a hired off-duty officer, grabbed my arm. I don't remember the punch. I remember the sky, then concrete, then Karen's voice saying, he attacked us first. Somewhere in that blur, someone was already dialing 911 and somewhere else, a phone camera was quietly recording everything. I woke up in an ambulance, head throbbing, Biscuit's bark still echoing somewhere behind me in the chaos. Officers separated us at the scene, taking statements. Karen spoke fast, polished, rehearsed. I could barely speak at all. He trespassed and became aggressive, Karen told the responding officer, dabbing at non-existent tears with practiced timing. I was almost arrested that night, until one officer noticed something odd: the guard had no visible injuries from an attack. Chelsea arrived just in time, breathless, holding up her phone. I have footage. I have it all. A neighbor across the street had filmed the entire confrontation from her window, every second, every word. The video showed Karen walking Biscuit into her garage first, before I ever arrived, before any trespassing occurred. Officer Delgado watched the video twice, his jaw tightening with each replay of Karen's calm, rehearsed lie unraveling. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this shows you took the dog before Mr. Reyes ever set foot on your property." Karen's composure cracked for the first time, a hairline fracture in porcelain she'd polished for years. "He's a decorated Marine with a documented service animal," Delgado continued. "You want to explain the leash you're holding?" I sat on the curb, ice pressed to my temple, watching the woman who'd terrorized my street finally squirm in public. She tried pivoting, mentioning the fines, the history of conflict, anything to reframe herself as the victim. But the footage didn't care about her narrative. Footage doesn't lie, doesn't soften edges, doesn't protect anyone's reputation. Biscuit was returned to me that night, trembling but unharmed, pressing his head into my chest like he understood. No arrests were made yet, but a report was filed, and for the first time, Karen's name was on it too. Priya called first thing the next morning. "This changes everything. Kidnapping a service animal is a federal ADA violation." She explained calmly what I already suspected: this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was a criminal matter. I handed Priya every file, the fake bylaws, the deleted footage, the audio of Karen's handling the situation comment. She went pale reading the financial discrepancies. "Daniel, this isn't just harassment. This is fraud on a scale that ends careers." We agreed on a plan, quiet, methodical, giving Karen enough rope to keep incriminating herself before we pulled it tight. Meanwhile, word of the dog kidnapping spread through the neighborhood faster than any HOA newsletter ever could. Neighbors who'd stayed silent for years started reaching out, sharing their own finds, their own strange, unexplained rule changes. Mr. Okafor admitted Karen had fined him for a garden gnome she claimed violated aesthetic harmony, a rule that didn't exist. A young couple shared texts where Karen had threatened to make their lives difficult after they questioned a fee increase. Each story added a thread to a tapestry Priya was quietly weaving into something Karen couldn't out-talk her way from. Karen, sensing the shift, tried a new tactic entirely: sudden, aggressive kindness, showing up with cookies and apologies. "Let's put this behind us," she told me on my porch, smiling like the assault had never happened. I smiled back, calm in a way that unsettled her far more than anger ever could. "Sure, Karen. Let's." She left relieved, not knowing that smile was the last calm moment she'd have before her world unraveled completely. That night, an anonymous email landed in my inbox, a whistleblower from inside the HOA's management company. The email contained years of internal memos flagging Karen's irregular fine patterns that management had quietly ignored. Turns out corporate had known for years and chosen profit over accountability, collecting their cut of every unjust fine. Priya lit up reading it. This isn't just Karen anymore. This is systemic. This is a lawsuit with real teeth. We scheduled a meeting with the county's HOA Oversight Office, armed with 3 years of undeniable documentation. Karen, unaware, was busy preparing something of her own, a special emergency board meeting to address community concerns. We later learned the real purpose: expelling me from the neighborhood entirely, using a rushed, secretive vote. The notice arrived 4 days before the meeting, buried in fine print most residents would never bother reading. Proposal to revoke residency privileges for repeated bylaw violations and safety concerns, it read, my name attached beneath it. I felt something shift in me, not fear this time, but a cold, focused determination I remembered from deployment. Priya reviewed the notice and actually laughed. "She's trying to legislate you out before the lawsuit lands." "Perfect. Perfect?" I asked, confused by her sudden calm. "She just tried to evict me from my own house." "Exactly," Priya said. "Now she's on record, in writing, retaliating against a documented ADA complainant. That's evidence gold." We began preparing quietly for the emergency meeting, gathering every resident willing to speak, every piece of proof we had. Chelsea recruited 3 more neighbors willing to testify about fabricated finds, each one previously too afraid to speak alone. Mr. Okafor agreed to bring his own documentation, the garden gnome find still taped inside his kitchen cabinet like a scar. Karen, meanwhile, prepared her own performance, rehearsing lines about community safety and protecting our shared values. She had no idea the meeting she'd called to destroy me would become the exact stage for her own downfall. The night before, I sat with Biscuit on the porch, his head heavy on my knee, and finally allowed myself to breathe. Tomorrow, I told him quietly, we find out if the street still believes in fairness. Chelsea texted at midnight, the county inspector confirmed. She'll be at the meeting tomorrow. Unannounced. Perfect timing. I barely slept, running through every scenario, every way Karen might try to twist even her own destruction into a win. Morning came gray and heavy with humidity, the kind of day that felt like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Residents filed into the clubhouse in numbers I'd never seen before, word of the dog kidnapping pulling out even strangers. Karen stood at the podium in a crisp blazer, folder in hand, ready to read my expulsion into the official record. She hadn't yet noticed the county inspector sitting quietly in the back row, badge tucked discreetly into her blazer pocket. We're here today, Karen began, voice smooth as ever, to discuss a resident whose behavior threatens our community's safety. I sat still, hands folded, letting her walk further into a trap she didn't yet know had been set. Mr. Reyes has repeatedly violated bylaws, endangered residents, and shown clear disregard for HOA authority, she continued. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not agreement, but discomfort, the sound of people finally hearing themselves in her words. I move, Karen said, to formally revoke Mr. Reyes' residency rights, effective immediately, per Section 14 of our bylaws. Priya rose calmly from her seat. Before this vote proceeds, I'd like to enter something into the record. Karen's smile flickered, thin as ice over deep water. This isn't an open floor, counselor. Please, sit down. It will be, Priya said, once the county inspector confirms Section 14 was never legally ratified by this board. Every head in the room turned toward the back, where the inspector stood, badge now clearly visible. That's correct, the inspector said. I've reviewed the county filings. Section 14 doesn't exist in any approved document. Karen's folder slipped slightly in her grip, the first crack in a mask she'd worn flawlessly for years. That's absurd, Karen snapped, though her voice had lost the silky confidence it carried moments before. I have the bylaws right here, she insisted, holding up pages that suddenly looked thinner than her authority. The inspector stepped forward. Those are your personal supplemental guidelines, ma'am. They were never submitted for county or resident approval. Gasps rippled through the crowd, residents realizing years of fines had been built on paper with no legal weight. Mr. Okafor stood first, holding his GNOME violation notice above his head like evidence at a trial. This too? Fabricated, the inspector confirmed after a glance, and the room erupted into overlapping voices, years of frustration finally uncorked. Karen tried regaining control. This is a coordinated attack, orchestrated by a disgruntled resident with a grudge. A disgruntled resident, Priya said calmly, whose service dog you kidnapped on camera, Mrs. Whitfield. She pressed play on a laptop connected to the projector, and Karen's own driveway filled the clubhouse screen. The room watched, silent and stunned, as Karen led Biscuit into her garage before I'd ever arrived at her house. Then came the audio, her own voice, drunk on power, saying she'd handled a veteran situation permanently. Someone in the crowd actually gasped out loud, hand flying to their mouth, as if hearing a confession in real time. Karen's husband, sitting near the front, put his head in his hands, clearly hearing this evidence for the first time himself. This is manipulated, Karen said, though nobody in the room was buying it anymore, not even the board members beside her. One of those board members, visibly shaking, stood up. I need to say something. I was told to stay quiet. He revealed Karen had personally instructed him to fabricate that threatening behavior complaint against me weeks earlier. She said it would make him look unstable before anyone noticed the audit issues. he admitted, voice barely steady. The word audit landed like a grenade. Priya seized it immediately. What audit issues, exactly? Chelsea then shared what we'd uncovered about the HOA Reserve Fund shortfall Karen had been quietly patching with fake fines. The inspector confirmed she'd flagged similar discrepancies weeks earlier, discrepancies the management company had conveniently buried until now. Karen's carefully built kingdom was collapsing in real time, each revelation pulling another brick from a wall she'd spent years reinforcing. I did what was necessary to protect this community's finances, she said, grasping for a narrative that no longer existed. You did what was necessary to protect yourself, Priya corrected, using residents as human collateral for your own mistakes. Karen's eyes darted toward the exit, but two officers, quietly called in by the inspector, now stood near the door. Mrs. Whitfield, one officer said, we'd like to ask you some questions regarding an animal cruelty and fraud complaint. The room went utterly silent, the kind of silence that feels louder than any shouting ever could. Karen looked at the crowd, the same crowd she'd fined, threatened and silenced for years, and found no allies left. This is a misunderstanding, she said weakly, her voice cracking under the weight of 200 witnessing eyes. Nobody moved to defend her. Not one voice rose in her favor. Silence, in that moment, was its own verdict. The officers escorted her out, not in handcuffs yet, but in a walk of shame every resident would remember for years. Her husband didn't follow her out immediately, sitting frozen, staring at a version of his wife he'd never truly seen. Chelsea squeezed my shoulder as the room slowly erupted into stunned conversation, relief mixing with disbelief in equal measure. You did it, she whispered. You actually did it. I didn't feel triumphant yet, not fully, just tired, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy. Biscuit, waiting outside with a neighbor, barked once as I stepped out, tail wagging like he already knew the news. In the weeks that followed, the county launched a full audit of Meadow Creek's HOA finances and Karen's tenure as president. Investigators found nearly $60,000 in fraudulent fines collected over 3 years, funneled to cover the reserve shortfall. Karen was formally removed from the board, banned permanently from holding any HOA position in the county. She faced charges for fraud, animal cruelty, and falsifying official community documents, each charge chipping away her old armor. The management company that ignored years of warnings lost their contract, replaced by a firm residents actually voted on. My case against her, combined with a dozen others, moved forward as a joint civil lawsuit for damages and fraud. Chelsea's testimony, along with Mr. Okafor's known fine and a dozen other absurd violations, became the neighborhood's dark comedy relief. They're turning it into a podcast, Chelsea laughed one evening. The known that broke Karen's empire. Even amid the seriousness, residents found room to laugh, the kind of healing laughter only shared trauma can produce. Mr. Okafor framed his fine notice and hung it in his hallway, a trophy of the tyranny they'd all survived. I finally repainted my trim the color I'd always wanted, no fine, no warning, no shadow watching from across the street. Biscuit returned to his old routine, chasing squirrels across a lawn that finally, truly, felt like mine again. Karen's house went up for sale within 2 months, the for sale sign feeling less like real estate and more like justice. At the final hearing, she avoided my eyes entirely, the woman who once stared me down now unable to hold a gaze. The judge's ruling was clear and unambiguous: restitution, a permanent restraining order and formal criminal charges moving to trial. Priya called it one of the cleanest HOA fraud convictions the county had seen in over a decade. I didn't feel joy exactly, standing outside that courthouse. I felt something quieter, the simple relief of being believed. Chelsea hugged me on the courthouse steps. You didn't just win your case. You freed this whole street. Mr. Okafor shook my hand firmly. You did what none of us had the courage to start. I told him it wasn't courage, just refusal to let someone rewrite the truth just because they held a clipboard. Karen ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges, avoiding trial but losing everything: her position, her home, her carefully built reputation. The last I heard, she'd moved 3 states away, somewhere nobody knew her name or her old, fallen kingdom. Meadow Creek elected a new board that year, one that actually read bylaws aloud before enforcing a single fine. I still keep that old case folder in a drawer, not out of anger anymore, but as a reminder of what proof can do. Biscuit sleeps by my door every night now, no leash cut short, no fence to fear, just a quiet street finally, truly at peace.